wrote this song. Anybody ask you who done wrote this song? Tell them it was me, and I was down the river and gone. Takes a worried man to sing a worried song. Takes a worried man to sing a worried song. Takes a worried man to sing a worried song. Worried man, but it won't be worried long.
Hi, everyone. I know it's about 6:30, but we're going to wait just a couple more minutes as there's still some people joining. So we'll start here in just 2 or 3 minutes.
My old hand's a good old hand. She lays eggs for the railroad man. Sometimes one, sometimes two, sometimes enough for the whole dang crew. Cluck old hand, picking and scratching and giving me a grin. Cluck old hand, lay one more egg for me and my man. My old hen, she cackles a lot. She cackles when it's cold. She cackles when it's hot. Cluck old hen, cluck and sing. Lay one more egg for me and my men. Makes me hungry for scrambled eggs. The old wildwood flower. I always like that song.
Evening, everybody. We are going to get started. Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Jen Burden. I'm with the Oil Region Alliance, and we manage the Oil Region National Heritage Area. And there I am the Heritage Project Manager. With me tonight is Jennifer Swatsworth of the Pennsylvania Lumber Heritage Region, where she is Project Manager. And welcome to our second in our series of 4 presentations called Boom Heritage. And we decided to do this because the Pennsylvania oil and lumber industries have a lot in common. And we don't get to spend enough time focused on that to show the similarities of the industries beginning in the mid-19th century, continuing through today. And I said, this is our second one. If you didn't join us last month, we had presenters from both the Drakewell Museum just outside of Titusville and then the Lumber Museum talking about some of the similar tools and methods that both industry use at around the same times. Our next one in March will be focused on women's history in both of the regions. It's a topic that's often overlooked and is not very easy to research. And in our 4th one in April will be on the environmental impacts of both industries on our regions. If you have not signed up for those 2 yet, there's still plenty of time to do that. You can go onto the Lumber Heritage Region's website and register through that, or just keep an eye out on either the Lumber Region or the Oil Region's Facebook pages, and there will be links there as well. So, welcome to tonight's presentation. Let me back up just real quick. Sorry about that. I do want to acknowledge how this program came about. The lumber and the oil regions are 2 of 12 Pennsylvania state heritage areas. And we receive funding through the Pennsylvania Department of Conservation and Natural Resources to do projects like this. And that's where the funding came from to do this series. For tonight's lecture, or I guess presentation really, we also had an additional funder, the Petroleum History Institute. So we thank both of those groups for making this happen. So tonight's presentation, we are going to do something a little different. I think this will be the most entertaining of our 4, not to throw shade on our other presenters, but these 2 will definitely keep you entertained. We have 2 reenactors who will be portraying characters from the oil and lumber industries from the mid-19th century, maybe a little bit later. And they'll be in character the full time. As you have questions, please put them in the chat and we will answer them at the end of the presentation. But let me introduce both of our presenters. First, we have Bill Stumpf. Bill has been telling stories professionally since 1976, but admits to being a liar all his life. He's retired from the Titusville Area School District after 35 years of teaching. He has traveled across the state performing programs, lectures, and workshops on storytelling for audiences of all ages. He became acquainted with Gibb Morgan's stories through the Drakewell Museum and has been telling them since 1986. Bill also operates the steam engine in the replica Drake's Well and is a site interpreter. Bill resides in Titusville with his wife, Mary Ellen. And I just want to throw this in, another character that, well, I won't say character, another figure that Bill plays comes around Christmas time. And I think you can figure out who we're talking about, and he's wonderful. Our other presenter from the lumber region is Van Wagner. He is an educator and musical artist. He teaches environmental science at Lewisburg High School and was selected as Conservation Educator of the Year in 2005 from Schuylkill County and in 2007 and 2009 in Union County. In 2012, he received the Sandy Cochran Award for Natural Resource Education from the Pennsylvania Forestry Association. In 2015, the Red Cross presented him with the Robert N. Purcell Distinguished Service Award. Outside the classroom, he educates audiences with music and programs on Pennsylvania history. He received an Outstanding Achievement Award in 2018 from the Pennsylvania Heritage Songwriting Contest. And just last year, he was recognized with an Outstanding Alumni Award from the Danville High School Alumni Association. His music has been featured on the History Channel, WVIA TV, the Country Music Television, also known as CMT, and in several film productions. He has released 31 original albums and published a book entitled Coal Dust, Rust, and Sawdust. His music and programs not only entertain, but inspire audience to become involved in learning more. Take it away.
Well, I always find it's nice to start with a song when people gather. So let's do exactly that. Well, the war, it was over, Mr. Lincoln had won. I drew my Navy wages and returned to my home, to Sullivan County, where my grandfather came. The soil was rocky and the sky always rained. I remember Grandpa's stories of when he was a kid, a bison in some lowlands and elk on the ridge. But now they're all gone and a new hunt has begun, to find the tie at dot and net and make the sawmills hum. All I need is my crosscut saw, my double bit axe, and 80 trees to fall. The spring, it's coming, I can smell it all around, and my soul's being tempted by that high water sound. On the loyal sock, it is straight and it's tall. There is pine up there like you ain't never saw. Only brave loggers bear the winter cold, and the snow falls heavy on that Appalachian fold. Well, it's up in the morning at 5 a.m. Throw down some biscuits, some coffee and ham. A 12-hour shift with a Teamster crew, skid logs to the water, through the ice and snow. All I need is my crosscut saw, my double bit axe, and 80 trees to fall. The spring, it's coming, I can smell it all around, and my soul's being tempted by that high water sound. Well, we lash our logs together with hickory and oak. No rope, no iron, just pins and bows. A sweep at the front and back and a shack for the crew. 20,000 board feet, ready to tie loose. When the ice finally breaks and the water's good and high, we'll head down the loyal sock, our crew of 5. A day on the raft down to Montoursville. We hit the Susquehanna where the water's smooth and still. All I need is my crosscut saw, my double bit axe, and 80 trees to fall. The spring is coming, I can smell it all around, and my soul's being tempted by that high water sound. once we get to Marietta, we sell off our logs. $100 split by 5 river hogs. And we head back north, walking all the way, with a hand on your knife and the other on your pay. Well, if it's a good season, we'll have 2 or 3 more runs. Then this year is over and summer has begun. I'll watch as the rust, it builds on my tools, and I'll long for the day I'm back with my logging crew. All I need is my crosscut saw, my double-lid axe, and 80 trees to fall. The spring, it's coming, I can smell it all around. My soul's being tempted by that high water sound. Woo-wee! Well, I like gathering around a fire with friends, and I see I have a friend here sitting down with me, so I'd like to learn a little bit about more of you. Who are you, friend, and what can you tell me about your story?
Well, good evening to you. That's a mighty fine picking you've done there. A lot of good history, too. Morgan's the name, Gibb Morgan. And my fame is known from Reno to Russia, from Roustville to Romania. I've been working in these oil fields since it was first struck back in 1859. And most of my work was around the Titusville oil fields, but I got into the business because basically the Civil War, back in the early days of Civil War, there wasn't much opportunity for work. Everyone had gone off to the service, but in 1859, the colonel, he struck oil right here in Titusville. Matter of fact, I'm sitting in the corner of one of the local establishments here. Now, I don't want you to get the idea that I do a lot of drinking. I can stop anytime I want. I just never wanted to, really. But I joined into the service. I was actually the first lie I ever told, because I was just nigh on to 20, and you had to be 21 to sign up. So I did have to lie about my age, but I joined the Pennsylvania 10th Reserve Infantry, Company C. They were known as the Franklin Grays. And it took a long time for us to get mustered in. And so I started telling stories to keep the guy's heart in the cause. I went in as a private. I came out as a private, but I had the distinction of being the minstrel of the battlefields. I was most known for my storytelling, and that's what most people still know me for. People still recognize me. They come up to me. Just to give you a little idea, I was sitting in one of the local establishments. The guys came in off the swing shift, and they said, "Hey, Gibb, how about telling us a lie tonight?" And I said, "Oh, no, not tonight, boys." I said, "I just got a telegram. My brother was killed on the drilling rig." He said he slipped off the derrick and fell and broke his neck. Well, they started buying me consolation rounds to cheer me up, you know. Down about the 5th round, the fellow brought the glass, set it in front of me and said, "Gee, Gibb, we're really sorry. We didn't know you had a brother." I said, "I don't. But you asked me to tell you a lie, didn't you?" And that's the kinds of stories that I usually told. When the war was over, the work was here in the oil fields. And prior to that, my dad was a lumberman. He was a logger, had a sawmill up on Tionesta Creek, and he made rafts for floating the oil down the stream. So I've kind of got a dual heritage here, part lumber and part oil. How about yourself?
Well, at least you're a straight shooter, so I like to know who I'm dealing with here at this fire. That's all right. Well, I tell you, I like that you mentioned rafts, because I find a lot of folks when I tell them what kind of work I do, they're not real familiar with the differences. So, you know, I always like to make sure we're on the same page with this. A lumberman who works the rivers is a raftsman. And a raftsman is sort of an independent contractor usually. And that's my preferred way of working. And that's where you head out in the woods, usually per contract. You work for a landowner, and they'll have white pine on their land that they want sent into the river. But then you don't just float it loosey-goosey on down the river. You attach it in a platform together. And the platform would then navigate with men on board on this floating platform called a raft. They'd navigate here where I'm at in the Susquehanna River. They'd navigate down, and eventually they're trying to get to Marietta. They'd sell their logs, and they'd all hike it back north up the Susquehanna River. But the other type of lumberman, and this is a growing field out there, I haven't made the jump myself yet, but these folks that are working in what they call the lumber camps, these folks that work 12 months of the year, they're using this brand new invention called the Shea locomotive. It's a railroad that lets them get deeper into the mountains than we've ever gotten before. And they use that crosscut saw. Boy, they cut a mean amount of timber, I'll tell you that. But it's a different way of doing business. They say there's folks there in Williamsport making millions of dollars doing nothing more than counting logs floating by the mills there. And to me, it's a different way of life. I always preferred the river life, just working the rafts and, coming down a few rafts per season and making enough money to keep the family going. But seems like everybody's gotten in a bit of a hurry now, trying to make as much money as they can. And I'll be honest, I do worry that they're pushing the forest a little too hard here in these decades lately. But I've been hearing
about a raft of logs. How many logs are you talking about here?
Well, the river dictates everything. The river will dictate whether or not you can have a wide raft or a long raft. So here on the Susquehanna River, in the headwaters of the Susquehanna River, you're limited to size. So in my song I was singing to you is about Loyalsock Creek. Loyalsock Creek, even in a flood, is not going to let you have much more than maybe 10 to 15 logs wide. And if you're lucky, up to about 100 feet long. And that'd be a big raft for the Loyalsock. But once you get down to the main branch of the Susquehanna River, we would often attach them side by side and then two more in the front. And so now you have 30 logs wide, and sometimes you're up to 150, 200 feet long. And you can actually keep doing that as you get closer and closer to the Chesapeake Bay. I mean, I've seen rafts that are what we call a fleet. And a fleet looks like, it is just acres of wood all attached together on their way down to the Chesapeake.
That's kind of interesting because we have the same thing here in the oil industry. The main way of getting the oil out was either by teamsters hauling out maybe 6, 8, 10, 12 barrels at a time. The teamsters would charge you $3, $3.25 per barrel to haul it out. And then the barrel cost you about $3, $3.25. And so you already spent $6.50, and depending on what the refineries were paying and the producers were paying, at one time the oil got down to be 10 cents a gallon. Now, one of those barrels, standard barrel, holds 42 gallons. So you were selling $4.20 worth of oil, and it cost you $6.50 to get it out of here. So it didn't make any difference how much you were making. You were losing money down the pipe. Now, you called them raftsmen. We had bargemen. Now, the main way of getting oil out of Oil Creek was Oil Creek. The railroads didn't come in here till 1862, 1865. So the main way of getting oil was to float the oil in rafts. Now, when I talk rafts, I'm talking a barge that's maybe 40 foot long, that holds 50, 80, 100 oil barrels. And they would have to float that down the creek. Now, you mentioned in your song about having a sweep oar to guide the rafts as you went down. Oil Creek was usually pretty low. In the spring, it was a pretty rushing river. But you get to summertime and you could walk across it. That's how deep it was. So what we would use was something called a pond freshet. Now, you in the rivers, you had the full river. All up and down Oil Creek, there were mills. We had sawmills, we had grist mills, we had mills of all different kinds. And everybody drew their water off of Oil Creek and had their own little dam and pond where they kept the logs or used the water for the wheels. Well, in order to get the oil out of here, the producers would get together and they'd say, 10 o'clock Saturday morning, we're going to ship oil. So you got your barge down on the bank, you loaded it up with your oil barrels, and some people couldn't afford oil barrels, so they just built the sides up with blanks and dumped the oil in as a liquid, just fresh, free in there. Kind of like trying to float a swimming pool down the creek, you know? Well, at 10 o'clock, the first guy upstream, he would open his dam and let the water back in. And then the second guy, and then the third guy. And what it did was, each time those dams were opened, the water would rise. And they would create an artificial wave about anywhere from 2 to 4 foot high. And you watched for that wave to come. And as soon as it passed you, you pushed off. Now, if you pushed off in front, it would flip you. So you had to wait till the crest got past. You came in behind it, and you basically surfed your way down to Oil City. Oil City was on the Allegheny River, and that's where the steamers came in to pick up the oil to take it to Pittsburgh or to New York, wherever the main refineries were. Well, you can imagine all these oil producers all trying to get their oil down that stream at once. You may have 50, 60 barges all trying to get down this small stream on this wave. The only way to steer them was with poles. So you were constantly pushing off and shoving. And whoever got down there first got the highest price. And as more and more oil came in, the prices went down. So you wanted to make sure you got down there, and you got down there ahead of anybody. So if you had a barge and I had a barge, you wouldn't make it. I'd shove you into a rock, I'd push you into the shore. There were pole swinging brawls out there, knocking people off their barges just so people could get past them. And every now and then, one of them would get slaunch-wise in the creek, and people would jump out with axes and just chop that barge to bits so that they could get their barges through. So there was always debris and oil barrels and loose oil all up and down those creeks. It was quite a melee. But then once the railroads came in, it was a lot easier. But it was a back and forth type of thing. Like you said with yours, you walk back up, build another barge, floated them down the next production.
That's great. My goodness. Well, yeah, the more I talk to you, the more I learn that our industries are quite similar. It's all about getting your goods to market before the competition and trying to do it with your life still intact. I'd love to show you some of the tools I have here at the fire tonight. I bet you recognize some of these.
Please do.
So for us, the most important tool in the woods is your axe. This is a double bit axe, and a good piece of steel is more important than anything. And you know, a lot of folks talk about the importance of that crosscut saw, but really the crosscut saw wasn't even invented till after the American Civil War. So this is what really took most of America's timber down and still is used to this day. So the double bit axe is very important. And then of course I have the Roustsman auger, and this is a special tool. This is what separates the Roustsman from just any old wood hick. This allows a man to stand on a log. See the end of there? It's a nice drill bit. And I can stand on my log when it's floating, and I can drill holes in my log. And what that's going to allow me to do is, if I put just a few inches of hole into the ends of my logs, I'll be able to attach all the logs together. I want you to picture this. You got two logs side by side, you drill some holes in them, and then you lay a long sapling of hickory across all those logs. And then over top of that hickory sapling, you're going to take a real flexible piece of like white oak. This is a real flexible piece of oak. I'm going to shape it like a bow, and I'm going to put it down in those holes. And then I'm going to pound that in tight with a hammer. And I'll tell you, when that river water gets on those pins, it's going to just totally swell tight. And now all my logs are held together with nothing more than wood. Another good tool I'll show you. This is also a riverman's good friend. This is the peavey. And the peavey is for rolling logs but it's also important for getting logs that are stuck unjammed. So you see that nice spike on the end. I can get down in between two logs and kind of work them loose if they're giving me trouble. This allows me to hook on a log and roll it. So just some really wonderful tools that we use here in the woods. I'll tell you that the last tool I'd like to show you is kind of the enemy, if I could. I told you that there's folks in Williamsport and they're trying to do things a little differently nowadays, and they're pushing us Roustsmen off the river, and they're trying to cut more timber and more timber. What they do now is, instead of rafting their logs to market, they cut their logs way up high in the headwaters, and they put the company brand on the end of the log. Every company has their own stamp. They stamp the company brand on the end of the log, and then they roll it into the Susquehanna River, and it floats to Williamsport. Now, I don't mean rafts to Williamsport. I mean it floats. And the reason I call them the enemy, well, here we are, the raftsmen, we're trying to come down. Let's say we're coming down with a load of rafts from Clearfield. We can't get past Williamsport because the river is just filled with these loose logs. So it's the big guy squeezing us little guy out of the market. I wonder if you can relate to that at all, Gibb.
Well, I'm familiar with especially the PV, because this area here in Titusville, before it was known for the oil, it was known for its lumber. And the lumber, again, was shipped downstream using the same water, the oil creek, as they did for the oil. We had the double-bladed, of course, you know, Paul Bunyan invented the double-blade axe. Because before Paul Bunyan, of course, you know, the axes got really, really dull. So the way the lumbermen used to do it is they would take a grindstone and they would start it rolling downhill, and they'd run beside it and keep their blade on the grindstone to sharpen it. But Paul got the idea of putting it in a little carriage with a pump wheel and kind of like an old Singer sewing machine, and that way they didn't have to do as much running down hills. It was bringing the stone back up that was the big problem. And they came in handy out in the petrified forest, because he could swing and sharpen with an easy motion. He would chop the tree, and when he came back, he'd run it against another petrified tree, sharpen the axe, fling it down again. And that's how he was able to bring down the petrified forest. But we had, now you called yourself a lumber hick or a log hick, or what? I forget what the official designation of.
I've been called all kinds of things. But wood hick is a name I've heard. I don't know if I like it or dislike it, but I like river rat. River rat's a more fitting name.
River rat. Well, we had all different kinds of names depending on the occupation. Now, you said river rat. You had your lumber hick. What in the oil industry, we had roustabouts, roughnecks, drillers, and tool dressers. Those were the main jobs on a drilling rig. You could run a drilling rig with two people, with a driller and with a tool dresser. But the job was awfully hard. The driller's job was to drill a round hole with a flat bit, just a chisel. And he had to drill a straight round hole down under the ground where he couldn't see. Now, the tool dresser, his job was to sharpen that bit so it would go back down in the hole and keep pulverizing. It didn't drill. The almost all of the rigs up until 20th century, when they started doing rotary, were all what they called percussion, where they raised and dropped, and just kept pounding and pulverizing their way down through the rock. Now, the first rotary was used in 1865 over in Pit Hole. The Pit Hole was one of the most famous, infamous ghost towns that turned out to be, but one of the biggest boom towns in the history of the oil industry. Started out as a farming community of 200, and within 6 months after the strike of oil, they went from a farming community of 200 to a city of 15,000. But it only lasted 500 days. The wells started to dry up. They didn't have any sanitation. They didn't have any water. Without water, you can't put out a fire, and you can't put out an oil fire with water anyway. So a lot of times things just had to burn down. But the tool dresser's job was to keep it sharpened. He also ran the engine, tightened the belts, greased and oiled all the equipment, stacked the wood, chopped the wood to keep the fire, the boiler going, keep the water in the boiler. And that got to be a pretty hard type of job. So other people started coming in. We had what they called the roughnecks. And the roughnecks were people who had some skills. They may have worked on a drill rig before, or they may have had a little bit of training in drilling, or they may be familiar with a steam engine. And so they were kind of working their way up to a higher position. The highest position on a drilling rig was the driller. He was the most intelligent, supposedly, by far, of the whole team. But then all those menial jobs fell to the roustabout. And the roustabout were probably local laborers, wanderers, vagrants looking for some type of job. And they put them to working with greasing the machinery, chopping the firewood and stacking it, so that the tool dresser and driller could focus mostly on their jobs. So that was the main types of occupations. How about the lumber business?
Well, the one thing that'll always make you desirable is if you're willing to work harder than the guy next to you and willing to learn new things. And so I've kind of become a jack of all trades. I've done the lumber work, but I used to actually work in the mines a little bit. When I first, came of age to be old enough to work, I was working in iron ore mines in Montour County. And so when you started talking about those drill bits, that was something I could relate to, because in any hard rock mining, it's a flat chisel bit that you pound with a sledgehammer down in those mines. I couldn't take the dark anymore, and I finally had to get out of working underground, and that's what took me out to the woods. But just you talking about that drilling took me kind of back to those days. But I'll tell you,
go ahead.
I say I brought a special thing here to the fire tonight that I'd love to play for you. This is, the guitar is fun and all, but this is, if we want to get old here, this is a Native American instrument. And I'm going to play a song on the mouth bow. And this is the kind of instrument that got passed from Native Americans to other folks coming into America. And when we're sitting around a campfire, you're going to hear a lot more mouth bows and maybe a fiddle and that kind of thing than you are going to hear guitars. Guitar was a special treat tonight, but this would have been the type of thing you hear in these mountain camps. He'll catch a fish in the Susquehanna, catch a fish in the Susquehanna, catch a fish in the Susquehanna, sit on the bank in the mud and the sand. So I don't know about you all, but we have to make our own music here in the lumber camps. That's how we keep ourselves entertained.
That I should have brought my juice harp along. I could have accompanied you. Well, you were talking about the bit with the chisel bit. Did you ever use a star bit, a star chisel, where you hit it and you turn it?
Yeah.
Okay, that's basically what the process was on a drilling rig. With this percussion, it wasn't just going up and down. I said the driller was the most intelligent. The driller would stand with his, or sit with his hand on that rope. There'd be a big wheel of rope. The rope would go over a pulley at the top of the derrick, come down, and the tools would be hanging off that rope. And it wasn't just a chisel. It was a chisel and various other pieces to give it weight. And those bits would sometimes slide inside each other and they would give double impact. But as we would lower that down into the well, and then there would be a big, kind of like a big seesaw, and it was called the walking beam, and it would raise and drop, raise and drop, and it would raise that chisel and drop it, raise it and drop it. Well, as that driller stood there, every so often, it turned that rope. So the bit would hit here and here and here and here and here. And that's how he was able to drill a round hole with a flat bit. But he could tell from the feel of that rope, he knew the shape of that hole down there, and he knew which way to turn it. And that's what made him so special. Now, I've been a driller, I've been a tool dresser. I brought in wells, oil wells, brought in a rum well one time, brought in a buttermilk well one time, was drilling down through a mountain face, drilled in, and darn if I didn't hit a beer well. Yes, sir. I'll come to find out that in the base of this mountain, there was a big cave, and that's where the brewmaster was keeping all the kegs with his beer in. Well, I drilled right down into that cave and right straight into a big keg of beer. They made me close it off, though, unfortunately. Now, you would mention.
Well, hey,
Okay.
I got something special here you might recognize. Now, sometimes when a person reaches for a mason jar, you kind of have to look both ways and make sure the lawman's not coming. But this is not that kind of mason jar. This is the original kind. This is the original oil that used to come from the forest. Smells like a campfire because this is pine tar. And pine tar is made from pitch pine. And this is still a way you can make money out in the forest to this day. You cut pitch pine into small pieces. And if you have shortleaf pine, you can use that too. Here in Pennsylvania, we have two pitch bearing and tar bearing species. We got pitch pine and we got shortleaf pine. Boy, I love that smell. And what you do is you pile the wood. It needs to be dead wood. You pile the dead wood in a pile like you're making charcoal. And then what you do is bake it. And after a few days, it starts to seep tar out of the bottom. So we would build a series of channels of clay to direct the dripping tar from the bottom. And then, ooh, that smells good. Just like you were saying with the barrels, you'd actually run it in the barrels and you could make good money on the side making tar if you had a good stand. The lumber wasn't worth much for pitch pine and shortleaf pine. People want that white pine, but white pine doesn't yield the tar. So you kind of have to, you know, the old saying, you make lemonade if you have lemons. Well, if you got pitch pine, you're not going to get a lot for the lumber, but you can get a couple dollars for the tar.
Well, around here, pine and hemlock were the two main species, and that's what most of the drilling rigs and the barrels and the rafts were made from. Instead of, we didn't do the pitch pine as much, but we had the bark skinners. And just downstream from Drake's original well, there was an acid works. They would make sulfuric acid from the bark of the trees. And they used the sulfuric acid to treat the oil to take some of the odor out of it. Because oil has distinct odor. And every place you go, the odor is different. And sometimes even the color is different. But I think it's a great smell. People come around and say, what's that horrible smell? It's like, what smell? I don't smell anything. You get kind of used to it. I'm sure you're the same type of person. You get used to that smell and it doesn't bother. I tell people that's the smell of money. That's what that is. But now, the oil had many uses. I mean, besides, well, I'm not sure what the lumber that you were bringing down the stream was destined to be. But in this area, the thing that really pushed the industry, and the reason that Drake was here and drilling for oil was that up until 1850, the main source of lighting was whale oil. But the whales were dying out and the the best oil came from the head, and they went after the sperm whale. They called it the right whale because it was the right one to get the oil out of. And they could get maybe 300 barrels out of a head of a sperm whale, but then they would also render down the fat into oil. And they would mix the good oil with some of the lesser quality. And that's the way they extended the catch and made more money that way. But whale oil in Drake's time had gotten to be about, $100 a barrel. Now, in nowadays money, in the modern days, that's $3,000 to $4,000 a barrel. Only the rich could afford any type of lighting. But in 1850, a fellow by the name of Samuel Keir came up with a process of turning crude oil into kerosene. Kerosene was cheaper, and with a few modifications on the lamps, it burned brighter, cleaner, less odor. Everybody wanted it, but they didn't have a commercial supply. So Drake was hired by the Seneca Oil Company to come here to Titusville to find oil in quantity to supply the kerosene industry. So the kerosene industry was already in place. Drake was here to supply the product for it. And as soon as he could get the oil in barrels, it was shipped to Pittsburgh, where it was turned into kerosene. And that's what really pushed the whole industry. And then people started to experiment, curiosity. Keir got the idea of, what if we take the oil and we heat it up? And we take it to this temperature, what would we get? And he experimented with different temperatures till he got the clarity and the flammability he wanted. And then people started thinking, well, what if we take it higher? What if we cool it off a little bit? What if we take after he's gotten all his kerosene off, what if we take the dregs and work with that? What can we make? And that's really what developed into this whole scheme of products that come from oil. It was basically a curiosity type of thing. But that's where the oil went to. Where did the lumber go?
Well, I tell you that you're teaching me so much tonight. I really appreciate it. Most of the lumber we send down the Susquehanna River is going either into the heartland of the farm country to build barns and schoolhouses and factories, but a good deal of it goes down all the way to the Tidewater, into the Chesapeake, and they build ships. In fact, the best sailing ships on the Atlantic Ocean have spars holding the sails up that are made of Pennsylvania white pine. That's the best you can get. So, well, I tell you what, we better do, Gibbs. I'm really enjoying talking with you tonight, but I see a few other folks gathering around our fire and they might have questions. So how about, I'm going to sing you a song that ought to suit you there in your tavern. That little brown jug next to you is making me thirsty. And then maybe we can chat a bit with the folks that have gathered around the fire.
Sounds good.
Well, down the road from me, there's an old holler tree where you lay to. And you go around that bend and you come on back again with a jug full of good old Mountain Dew. They call it that good old Mountain Dew, and them that use it, they are few. I'll hush up my mug if you fill up my jug with that good old Mountain Dew. My Uncle Mort, he's short off and short, he measures only 4'2". But he thinks he's a giant if you slip him a pint of that good old Mountain Dew. They call it that good old Mountain Dew, and them that refuse it, they are few. I'll hush up my mug if you fill up my jug with that good old Mountain Dew. So let's see who's gathered around this fire and if they have questions for us here. Let's see, Jen, are you still here at our fire? And if so, how do you want to do this?
I am. Can you hear me?
I can.
All right. We don't have any questions yet. So audience, if you have some questions, go ahead and hit the chat button or the question and answer button at the bottom of your Zoom. And we'll see if either one of these guys can answer them for you. We do have, however, the other Jen did ask, while we're waiting for the other questions to come in, Gibb, whoops, let's see. Where was your father working in the lumber industry, and what jobs did he do?
My dad was a carpenter and then got into the lumber business, and he bought a sawmill, and they sawed lumber and made barges for floating the oil barrels down the stream. It was prior to the Civil War, and we were living in Tionesta at the time. My dad was Burgess of Tionesta for several years, and then we moved on out to the lumber camp and lived out there.
Great, thank you. Van, another question for you. Van, were the lumber jobs seasonal? What did the rafters do when the waterways were frozen?
Yeah, so that's a great question that we're gonna have to split into two pieces. If we're gonna talk about Roustsman, then that is definitely seasonal work. However, it's traditionally around the wet season of spring. However, I have seen rafts going down the Susquehanna River, in terms of my research, 12 months of the year. It all depends on when the freshets came. Bill mentioned freshets. Freshets can be man-made, as you heard, but they can also be just a natural phenomenon. So you get a good couple Pennsylvania thunderstorms, and it could be August or September when the river's usually getting kind of low. But if these guys had white pine ready, they'd quickly raft it to market. But let me give you the typical answer. The typical answer is these were farmers that did the rafting. And so a lot of times they were, farming all summer. And then when fall would come into winter, that's when they're actually felling the timber, which is great because you got snow on the ground. So you can use your horses and a bobsled to skid your logs down to the creek or river. And then by March and April, when the thaw is getting ready, you're about ready to put your rafts together, float it to market. It's going to take you a few weeks to get all that done. And then guess what? You're back home with seed money to start your next year on the farm. A good friend of mine who's a farmer said to always remind audiences that a good way to make a small fortune in agriculture is to start with a large fortune. And his point is it costs a lot of money to farm. And so, these farmers needed all the money they could get. So rafting was a way to supplement the income. And then the other part of this answer was like, okay, well, what if they're just these loggers, these loggers who were people that went 12 months of the year into lumber camps and were logging with crosscut saws and Shay locomotives? That's a different monster. And that would go year round. If they had a contract to fill, they would do it year round, which as an environmental scientist would kind of raised my eyebrows when I thought of that, because I thought, my goodness, they're out there when the rattlesnakes are out there. And that had to be a whole different ballgame for them.
Great. Thank you, Van. All right. We have a question for Gibb, Bill. When did the Drake well era end?
When did it end?
Yes.
Actually, it never did. People said, when did the oil dry up around Titusville? The oil hasn't dried up. There are still hundreds of working wells in the area. People with small leases, 5, 6, 10 wells that are still producing, depending on what price they can get at the refineries. It went in booms, and that's one of the words in this introduction. Wherever people could see more oil being produced, they went there. So Drake was producing 10 to 20 barrels a day with his well. That was phenomenal. No one had ever brought that in before. And so people rushed to the oil valley and they started producing wells. We had wells in this valley producing 10 to 20 barrels and even thousands. There were 3 wells in this valley producing 3,000 barrels of oil a day. Eventually, for a couple reasons, the wells began to slow down. Number one, in many cases, you had several people having drilled into the same pocket of oil. So it was like putting multiple straws in the same milkshake. You're drawing out all this oil. What brings the oil up? Now, you've seen pictures of the big geysers gushers coming up out. That's the natural gas, which is produced with the oil. And the gas brings the oil up. Well, you take off a certain amount of volume, the pressure goes down. It's like those hand sprayers that you fill with water and you pump up and you spray, but then you have to pump up again because you've lost your pressure. That started happening and these wells started slowing down. Wasn't necessarily because the oil was drying up. They didn't have the pressure to bring it up to a pumpable depth. The other problem was paraffin wax. The paraffin wax is a natural product in Pennsylvania crude oil, which is what made it so good. Such a good lubricating oil and such a good burning oil. But the paraffin would actually clog the wells, clog the pipes, and the wells would slow down. And people said, oh, wells are drying up. No, they were clogged. And that's where nitroglycerin came in to blow that debris out of the well and bring it back into production. But the wells started, you have a well for 100 barrels and then suddenly it's producing 50, down to 25. And over at Pit Hole, they're getting 200. Let's go to Pit Hole. Pit Hole started to dwindle. Bradford came in. Let's move to Bradford. So it was a follow the boom type of situation. And these areas never totally dried up. They're still in production. They don't produce the volume that they did back in Drake's day, but the oil is still here. If that answers the question.
It does. Thank you very much. So Van, I have a couple questions for you. The first one is, when did the lumber industry start in Pennsylvania and where did the workers from, which I think you kind of answered for the most part with the farmers that did the work in the winter while they weren't farming. But when did it start and where did the workers come from?
It started about 10,000 years ago after the last ice age with Native Americans. One of the things that my eyes have become much better at seeing are stone tools. And here where I live along the Susquehanna River, I'm just amazed at how many axes I find. The amount of woodworking done by Native Americans just had to be incredible. Based solely on the amount of axes that I find. We'll put it this way. I have found far more stone axes in my life, just being out in the environment, than I have old rusty single bit and double bit axes. And I find plenty of them too. But let's get to the more like looking at this as like an industry. Let's answer it that way. As an industry, it really became a cash commodity in the 1700s. There's a wonderful book I highly recommend called Susquehanna, River of Dreams. And it's by Suzanne Stranahan. And while the book is not only about logging, her chapter on logging along the Susquehanna River is some of the best literature I've ever seen in terms of one-stop shopping, if you want to read some really well documented information. And she has good information in there about logging for cash in the 1700s down the Susquehanna River. And it really was, other than the farmers, in terms of when did it become, an industry, it just like any industry, it was what nation was giving us their immigrants in that decade. That's who we got. So, in the 1840s and 50s, you're seeing some Irish move in from the potato famine. By the 60s and 70s and 80s, you're seeing some Germans come in, some Italians. By the 1890s, 1900, you're seeing Slovaks and Poles. Lithuanians. It's all about what European nation was having hard times and who was sending us their immigrants, because you find it all, but it all depends on the era.
Great, thank you. This is a question for today. Do you know, Van, if there are any small pockets of virgin hemlock or pine that will be standing in the year 2022?
Sure. A couple places I'd love to tell you about this by pointing out that the hemlock, our state tree, has been under attack by an Asian insect called the woolly adelgid. And before we all blame Asia, we brought the woolly adelgid here. We Americans did by accident in a shipment of goods that we asked for. So this is a problem that we didn't ask for, but we have now. And the hemlock tree is just not what it used to be. Even in my childhood, I can remember stands of hemlock where in the middle of the day, it seemed like it was twilight. The sun seemed to be gone from the sky, and that's becoming quite rare. But let me give you more of a positive answer. Where can you see virgin timber? Because they are out there. Each pocket of the state of Pennsylvania has places that celebrate natural areas that are close to virgin timber or virgin timber. I have a few favorites. One of my favorites is Ricketts Glen. And although Ricketts Glen is not truly a pure virgin stand, it's some of the prettiest timber you're going to see, at least in my region of Pennsylvania. One that's on my to-do list is the Hammersley area. Hammersley is up in the Renova area on Kettle Creek, and I've heard reports of the white pine there. My friends that have seen the white pine said, you'll swear you're in California. These trees are just like nothing you've seen. And then also Middleswarth is a natural area not too far from where I teach in Lewisburg. But I'm giving you a very regional answer. There are these pockets out there. So if people are interested in seeing virgin stands of white pine and hemlock, they do exist. You just have to do your Googling, and they are worth the hike. And I would encourage you to get out there and see them soon, because like I'm saying, the hemlock is disappearing. And I don't want to be a pessimist, but it makes me wonder, how many decades till we lose the white pine? How many decades till we lose the white oak, the red maple? All of our trees, we are so lucky to have them, but don't take them for granted. We could lose them just like we're losing the ash tree or any other species we're losing right now.
Great, thank
Over
you.
in this area, if I can respond also, we have Cook's Forest, which is a virgin forest of pine, and then Letchworth State Park has beautiful, beautiful trees.
Thanks, Bill.
Great.
Yeah, I got out to Cook's Forest about 2 years ago and to perform. And I said, I've been wanting to come here for years. I forget their names, but they actually had their white pine trees named. They were so famous for their size. And I said, I'm here to see him. I don't remember if it was called the Admiral or the Captain or whatever it was. And he said, the host said, I'm sorry. 3 months ago, he came down in a storm. I can show you the stump, but he came down. And so I missed it by 3 months, the biggest tree, at least at that time. But you're right. There's still plenty of big ones there.
All right, we just have a few more quick questions. Bill, what is the oldest producing oil well?
The oldest, I know this one.
Good.
The oldest continuous producing oil well in the world is in a little place called Roustville, which is about 12 miles south of Titusville, before you get to Oil City on Route 8. It was drilled in 1861, 2 years after Drake's well, and it still produces oil. And the museum has the rights to pump that well. And when you come to Drake Well, you can purchase a little souvenir bottle of oil, and it is oil from the McClintock well, the oldest producer.
Thank you. That's very informative. All right, Van, what diameter were the logs and how tall were the trees when they were sending them down the Susquehanna?
If you're talking about just standard, headed for a sawmill white pine, they usually didn't monkey around with anything less than 20 feet long, and especially in the early days. Now they had to be less particular later on, but they wanted a 20-foot log, or better yet, a 40-foot log for these rafts, and which is amazing. I'm a logger today. I do sustainable forestry on the side, and I don't deal with too many 40-foot long logs nowadays. And the other thing about that's incredible is the demand for quality in that era. If they got to the part of the white pine tree where the branches come out, if you can picture a typical white pine tree, it's a beautiful, beautiful trunk with kind of a fluffy top. They stopped as soon as the branches stopped, even if the diameter might still be 2 or 3 feet in diameter. If they're hitting branches, that part was just left in the woods to rot because nobody wanted to monkey around with the knots. They wanted the straight part that didn't have knots in it. Now there is a specimen called a spar. I mentioned it in the program tonight. A spar would be the thing that held the sail up, and a spar was well over 100 feet. I mean, I've seen documented 120 feet long. And again, we're not talking how tall the tree is. We're talking about how tall the trunk is of good knot-free lumber. And that had to be the best of the best. And if you could get a spar 90 to, let's say, 120 feet, That was some really big money. And sometimes when I've read some of these accounts in the 1800s about what people paid for a spar, I read it and I think to myself, that has to be a mistake. So for example, I've seen $1,000 documented for a spar, and I've read that and I've thought that's a mistake. You know, people are making $1 a day. This is not correct. Well, it is correct. Basically, if you had the perfect specimen of a spar, it's kind of like the Hemi in a Dodge truck. It's the most important thing. And if you don't have the right spar, the rest of your ship doesn't matter. And so shipbuilders would pay an absolute premium for a superb white pine. And if you were one of the lucky landowners to have one of those on your property, think about that. You know, there's no comparable. I can't give you any example of a tree today in Pennsylvania that's like that. So even our most valuable, like let's say black walnut, sure, it is possible to get a few $1,000s for a black walnut tree if you've got a lot of lumber in it. But like in the 1800s, to be getting $1,000 for one stick of timber, whew, that's some big money.
All right, that is all the questions we have for this evening. Again, thank you both for this very informative and very entertaining webinar. I'm Jennifer with the Lumber Heritage Region, and we also have Jennifer we like to keep things easy here, so we just keep the same name. Jennifer with the Oil Region, and we thank everybody for joining us. Don't forget that we have our next seminar coming up in March, and if you aren't already registered, get registered for that. And Van, Bill, if you guys have any closing remarks, you're welcome to say them, but thank you both very, very much. It's very appreciative.
I'll close with a hurrah for the Union. Hurrah for the Union.
If you've never been to Van's area, the forests are just absolutely incredible. And if you've never been to Drake Well, please come down. The museum is fantastic. The site interpreter is incredibly knowledgeable and handsome. And and one of the biggest liars to ever come down the pipe.
Well, thank you both very much,
Thank you,
and we
Dan.
wish everybody a good evening. Take care.